Well, good morning and welcome to the Capital Times Morning Scoop webinar for January 26th. My name is Ron Doba and I'm moderating. I'll be going over the format and of this morning's webinar and introducing our panelists shortly. We're going to wait a minute or so while all the participants complete logging in to the webinar. So we'll give them a little bit of time. In the meantime, our topic for today's webinar is groundwater. Some of our panelists represent rural areas of the state. So largely what you're going to be hearing is a rural perspective on groundwater issues. Nevertheless, as we all know, water is water, whether you live in an active management area or outside of an active management area in the rural areas of the state. Our session is being recorded, so it's going to be available online, and it'll probably go online later this afternoon on the Capital Times YouTube channel. So if you can't see the whole thing, then you'll have an opportunity to view the recording later on. So, okay, folks are still registered, or they're still logging in, it looks like, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to talk about today. Again, welcome to the Capital Times Morning Scoop webinar titled Groundwater, What It Is and Why More Needs to Be Done. Again, my name is Ron Doba. I'm with the Northern Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. I want to begin by thanking our sponsor, the Environmental Defense Fund, as well as the participants that we have today who are, taking time out from their busy schedules to be able to be with us this morning. We have 4 panel members that I will be asking questions of individually. And if those of you who are participating have any questions, please submit them in the chat. Haley Paul from the Audubon Society and Chris Custis from the Environmental Defense Fund worked together with us to put this webinar together for this morning. And they're going to be monitoring the questions. Many of those questions they'll be able to respond to, and they will. Some of them they will decide should be forwarded on to our panelists. So depending on how the time's going this morning, they'll be sending those questions on to me, and I'll pose them to whoever we feel is the most appropriate individual on our panel this morning. Now, to begin, let's introduce our panel. Today we have the chairwoman of the Yavapai Apache Nation, Tanya Lewis, Mojave County Supervisor Travis Lingenfelter. We have a groundwater modeling guru from Matrix New World, Nathan Miller, who's going to be talking about groundwater from a general perspective. And we also have Wilcox Basin water user Steve Kiesel, who's very familiar with recent attempts that have been made to form an active management area in the Wilcox Basin. Also with what's happened in the Douglas Basin, where an active management area was formed. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about groundwater to begin with in a general issue about what it is and what it's doing out there underground. So I'm going to start with Nathan Miller with Matrix. Nathan's been involved in a number of modeling projects over the years throughout the state, all around the state, and he has a wealth of experience that he should be able to share with us this morning. So Nathan, to begin with, can you describe some of the trends that you're seeing in groundwater levels around the state, either based on your groundwater modeling experience or trusted data that you've seen or examined from that's out there from other projects?
Hi, good morning, Ron, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. Yeah, to answer your question, well, first, groundwater models. I'm a groundwater modeler, so I feel very passionate about groundwater modeling. But I think this question, I think it's better to start with measured data, because that's something that really we can all agree for the most part that the measured data are real. You know, we can actually see what's happening. ADWR Field Services measures and maintains a database of groundwater levels throughout the state. And this is a valuable resource that a lot of us use for characterizing aquifer conditions. So it's called the GWSI database. And if you go to their website, you can see lots of cool trends. You can look at hydrographs of how water levels are changing in different areas. So first, I know we're talking about rural Arizona today, but just to start off, you know, in the active management areas, the Phoenix, Tucson, and Pinal active management areas, where historical groundwater level declines in the 60s and 70s those were largely reversed with the introduction of CAP water in the mid 1980s, and groundwater levels have really recovered from that period. There was a lot of decline, and things really came up with the introduction of CAP water. In recent years, in some areas, that trend has started to kind of turn the corner, and there are some areas that are starting to see declines again. And you know, it'll be interesting to see now that our CAP water supply is going to be less, and there will be more reliance on groundwater, how some of those trends shape up in the coming years. It's a little too early to tell. So in other areas of the state, another thing that's really helpful, there's the Arizona Blueprint tool that shows groundwater level declines throughout the state in different basins. You know, one that to talk about is the Wilcox Basin. I know Steve will probably talk more about this, but you know, in that area, decades of agricultural pumping have resulted in about 200 to 300 feet of groundwater level declines overall from pre-development conditions, and recent declines, you know, as high as about 5 feet per year have been measured in area wells. Another area to mention is the Wallapai Basin near Kingman. Water levels in some of the wells have declined, you know, up to 50 feet in the last few decades, and rated about 1.6 feet per year. So in that basin, I'll just mention, you know, one thing that is important is that, yeah, we have these measured declines, but the groundwater models are important, and you know, that's an example of a basin where, you know, if there's projected increases in agricultural use over time, we do expect those trends to decline trends to increase, and so that's where groundwater modeling comes in. We can do some forward projections and look to make some decisions about how we're going to move forward in an area where there may be significant increases in agricultural use, for example.
Great, thanks, Nathan. And why do communities bring your company on to examine groundwater supplies and groundwater supply scenarios?
Yeah, I maybe even started to allude to that in my last response. So communities come to us often to help answer questions about their future groundwater supply. So sometimes it's to help them identify the best locations for future wells, or we build groundwater models to evaluate potential aquifer conditions under varied future conditions. You know, we can't predict the future, but we can use models to look at how the future might shape up if certain things happen. And so, you know, we're often building models that look at, you know, if groundwater pumping increases by this amount in the future, what's going to happen? What options do we have for what to do and how to manage the groundwater supply? Often we're asked to help with demonstrating compliance with the assured and adequate water supply requirements. And that typically involves running groundwater model simulations to demonstrate 100-year physical availability of water.
Well, and we also know that the groundwater situation is different in various areas of the state based on the aquifers that are being accessed. Can you explain the different areas of the state, why they have different groundwater situations, such as what we see in northern Arizona versus alluvial basin fill aquifers.
Yeah, sure. The short answer is geology rules. So there are different geologic conditions in these different areas that basically mean that the hydraulic properties, the characteristics of the aquifer vary in different areas. So the state has 3 physiographic provinces. There's the Coconino Plateau in the northeast third of the state. There's the Basin and Range in the southern part of the state. And then there's the transition zone in between the two. And the groundwater situation varies considerably depending on which province you're in. The Basin and Range has deep alluvial basins that are between the mountains. They're filled with alluvial material. Well yields in the alluvial basins, are regularly greater than 1,000 gallons per minute. And where the alluvial materials are coarse, the wells can pump, up to 4,000 gallons per minute in some cases. Depth to groundwater in alluvial basins varies considerably, but is generally between 200 and 500 feet below land surface. There are some areas where it's very shallow, less than 100 feet to groundwater. The aquifers.
Well, the models that you use certainly are a valuable tool in injecting anticipated additional pumping and seeing what effect it has on other areas. Can you kind of explain in layman's terms so everybody can understand just how a groundwater model works? How is it constructed?
I will. I'll do my best here. Groundwater models, they're basically computer simulations of aquifers. So they allow us to synthesize a considerable amount of expert hydrogeologic data of different types into a single cohesive tool. And that simultaneous consideration of this quantity of data isn't possible without a model. So it's a way to put everything into one tool. When we build a groundwater model, we first construct a conceptual model. We look at the geology and we look at estimate the hydraulic properties of the geologic layers, and we estimate the water budget, inflows such as natural recharge, outflows such as stream discharges. We construct a model to simulate varying stresses over time, over a historical period, and then we run the model to see how well it replicates that historical period. And that's called calibrating. We vary the uncertain parameters of the model to better replicate the history, and then we know it's a tool that we can use to make predictive scenarios for management decisions.
Well, Nathan, of course, my background is not in hydrology; it's more in business. And when I think of a model, I think of it more as I compare with a budget. It's an estimate. But with the improvements that we've been seeing in the modeling tools that we're using, how much can we depend on a model? Can you say for how accurate are they nowadays? Pretty close.
Well, groundwater models are definitely not perfect predictors of the future, and so you can think of it kind of like you see a weather map when they predict where the storm's going to go. The path of the storm gets wider as that prediction goes further into the future. Same thing with groundwater models. That we don't know the exactly what's going to happen under various conditions that haven't been tested yet, but we can look at the model and run them in those ways where we really think about this is a tool that puts together all of this science and helps us predict what might happen under varying conditions. We need to be running those tools because it really, and I'll also say it is a way that scientists, that represent different interests can all come together and agree on a path forward. It's a decision-making tool.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that information. A lot of us are seeing in the news this issue of the model that was developed for the West Valley that was just released recently. Were you involved in that modeling effort at all, or is there anything you can share with us about that?
Sure. Well, the groundwater model of the lower Hassayampa subbasin, it was released by ADWR earlier this month, Arizona Department of Water Resources. As long as I've been in consulting, my company has been involved with doing groundwater resources work for several landowners in that basin. But this new model was released by ADWR, and there were, it builds upon some of the past work that was done. There was a model that was constructed by Brown and Caldwell back in 2006, and like I said, we've done a lot of work out in that basin, but that particular model is an ADWR product, and it does include a 100-year predictive model scenario for a regulatory tool for the Assured Water Supply Program. And that, when you see some of the headlines of the unmet demand, those are the results of that predictive model scenario.
Great. Thanks for that information. So also, the Department of Water Resources is moving forward with a supply and demand study for, I believe, all the basins throughout the state. What's the difference between a groundwater model and this effort that's going forward by the Department of Water Resources?
Yeah, the ADWR supply and demand analysis, it's a basin scale quantification of the various water demands within each basin, and a quantification of the various water supplies that are available to meet those demands. While the supply and demand analysis will likely estimate the groundwater available based on hydrologic data, it's not a simulation of aquifer conditions like a groundwater model is. So it isn't going to look at the complexities of the geometry of the aquifers and where the wells are going to pump. But one important input to that, I would hope, would be some of the groundwater models that have been constructed in some of these basins. They do provide useful information to quantify the groundwater resources that are available in these basins. And I just want to emphasize that groundwater models are important partially because location is so important. Where you put the pumping wells in a model has a large impact on how much unmet demand the model generates, or how much groundwater level declines there are here or there. And one other thing I just want to say is, there are, when scientists go in and they estimate the volume of groundwater that's available in a basin, if they're not thinking about the complexities of how you pump that water out of the basin, you can often overestimate how much groundwater is available for development. You really have to think about the logistics and of how you're going to pump that water. You can't pump every drop of groundwater out of a basin, so you have to be pretty careful about how you come up with those numbers.
Yes, I would think that the demand part of that effort should be much easier to come up with than the supply part of it when we're dealing with the situation in some areas of the state. As you said, it varies considerably. So, okay, well, Nathan, thank you very much. We're going to move on from our general discussion about groundwater to the northwestern area of the state, around Mojave County. And as I indicated, we have Mojave County Supervisor Travis Lingenfelter, who's joined us this morning. And he's going to share some of the things that have been going on up there. I know more recently there has been an irrigation non-expansion area that has formed up in that area. Supervisor Lingenfelter, you've been a leader in the push for implementing groundwater management in your region, Mojave County, and the city of Kingman. Can you tell us a little about what's driving this?
Absolutely, Ron. I appreciate that question. I think it can be answered kind of in two ways. I think globally, in Arizona right now, and the Southwest in general, there's really no more important work than to secure our state's water supply, our groundwater supply, especially in the 80% of Arizona that's still considered rural. In many of our rural communities, it's their only water supply. The other thing I think globally that's kind of pressing this is right now Arizona has, outside of the active management areas or the INAs, really no rules on who can use rural groundwater. So I think that those two things, you know, um, you know, the fact that we don't have any rules in rural Arizona as to, you know, who can use groundwater, how many wells you can drill, how big those wells can be, how much water you can pump, the fact that you don't have to report how much you're pumping. It's really a recipe for disaster. But from a business standpoint, it's caused Middle Eastern companies, Californian companies, out-of-state international companies to come into Arizona in our rural areas to take advantage of our land and our finite groundwater. I know in the Kingman area, that's why we got involved. So locally, what's driving our work is the Wallapai Valley groundwater basin, which you mentioned. We recently secured the first INA in 40 years since the Harquahala Basin in 1982. But the reason we got involved was we saw first ADWR did a matrix study, then the city of Kingman and the county of Mojave got together and we commissioned a USGS study and for them to build us a specific water model for our Wallapai Basin. And the data was really shocking. You know, if nothing was done, if we didn't get any relief, the city of Kingman and the immediate outside area, so you're talking about over 70,000 people, their water supply was going to be in some pretty severe jeopardy. So we had to do something.
And as a result of all this that's been going on with folks coming in to utilize some of those water resources, what are the trends that you're seeing in the region? What kind of trends as far as water supply goes are the ones that are worrying you?
Sure. Well, for those that aren't familiar with Mojave County or the Kingman area, if you turn the clock back to maybe 2012, we really didn't have a lot of commercial agriculture in the Kingman area. We had a few vineyards. I've been told even way back then that the soil in Kingman is better than Temecula, so we had just a handful of vineyards. Fast forward just a decade, we've had Middle Eastern and out-of-state, mostly California, commercial agricultural corporations that have come in and purchased just under 78,000 acres within our basin. At the time that the INA was implemented, they were farming collectively, we think about 8,400, but you can imagine, you know, just how much groundwater they would have pumped on an annual basis if they were allowed to get into 30, 40, 50, 60,000 acres of agriculture. The water supply here is the basin. It's the Wallapai Valley Groundwater Basin. It's what residential, commercial, industrial, we all depend upon that. There really is no plan B here in the Kingman area for a groundwater supply. We don't have a canal system. We don't have Colorado River water. We have this basin. So that really drove our work. In that decade, we saw over 182 non-exempt wells, those wells that are capable of pumping over 35 gallons per minute, drilled. About 20 of those are larger than any of the city of Kingman's municipal wells. 20 of them are sized very large, 3,000 to 3,500 gallons per minute. And to kind of equate that, that's over 4 million gallons of groundwater each one of those very high capacity wells would be able to pump. So we definitely had to do something.
Generally, can you talk a little about how you and other elected officials and stakeholders in rural Arizona are coming together to demand more options from the state legislature when it comes to groundwater management outside of active management areas?
That's a great question. You know, over the last couple of years, I'm really pleased at the progress that we've made in rural. We have a rural groundwater working group, counties and communities from rural areas all over the state. We're meeting regularly, and we're trying to combine our forces and our efforts and our time to really press this issue forward and advocate and educate on this very important issue. Recently, you know, the mid-sized counties, Mojave County, Coconino County, Yavapai County, La Paz County, and several others across the state, we've come together. We've gotten some really good media attention over the last couple of years. I know Supervisor Horstman from Coconino County, Supervisor Michaels from Yavapai, myself, we teamed up last year during the legislative session to write an op-ed piece, which appeared in the Arizona Republic. I've just heard that CNN is actually going to publish a story on our groundwater this weekend. So that's certainly helped. Our advocacy has helped. And I think that it's incredibly important that we continue that advocacy and education with how many freshman legislators we have, both in the House and the Senate this year. But I'm very pleased at the progress we've had. Last session, we were still talking about rural groundwater in June, which was phenomenal, you know. So I think that we just have to keep building upon that work together. We're stronger together. So.
Great, thank you. You know, we've got some existing tools in the state for managing water, active management areas for one, and irrigation non-expansion areas as another. And we know that for the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about trying to develop something different than those. And why do you think more places want more options than the current ones, namely the AMAs and the INAs?
That's a great question. And really, yeah, that's it. You captured it. The AMA and the INA are really the only tools that we have in the state right now. I think a lot of folks in rural Arizona, they view those two tools as being pretty rigid tools, not having enough regional input and control. So what we have been advocating for the last several sessions, and bills have been introduced prior from our legislative district 30, now legislative district 5, Regina Cobb, who is no longer in the legislature, but every year she's introduced bills to try to introduce a new tool for rural areas that would take really the best parts of the AMA and really marry that up with much more local input or regional input and local control, where the regional area, because every region in Arizona is different. We all have different economic development plans. We all have different economies, that those regional voices would be able to help put together the plan and the goals for management of the groundwater basin. So,
are there any current proposed legislation, groundwater management bills that you're hopeful about, and why?
Yes. So this session, and it has not been introduced yet, but Leo Biasucci, who's one of Mojave County's representatives, also the majority leader in the House this year, he's going to be introducing a bill. The title is going to be Local Groundwater Stewardship Areas, replaces the prior bills in prior years. Most people knew those as rural management areas. We've stepped away from that term, and you know, I think all of the stakeholders across the state and rural have had input into this new legislation. So I feel really good about that once it's introduced, and I really just hope that both sides, you know, the Republicans, the Democrats, our new governor's office, they do everything that they can to really push that legislation through and get it into law, because, you know, we really have two different Arizonas right now. We have the Arizonans that have the security and the surety, and they're not perfect under the AMAs, and then you have the 80% of Arizona that is in rural, where there really is no rule or no law. It's the wild, wild west, and it's very hard to do long-term planning in that scenario. So hopeful for
Well, you know, over the years, with these bills that have been proposed and really haven't gotten any traction, haven't been, you know, approved, obviously, by the legislature. What kind of opposition have we run into on those bills?
Well, I think in large part it has to do with the way our legislature is made up and the way bills go through the legislature. Each committee, both in the House and the Senate, they have a committee chair. And if that committee chair does not want to hear your bill, then your bill is not going to get heard. And in order to keep pushing it, you have to go to some more creative ways to try to get that language heard through a striker or something else. That's not ideal. In our case, it's been Gail Griffin, who for a long time just hasn't been willing to sit down around a table to try to work through, I think, maybe the Farm Bureau's concerns, to a lesser extent, maybe the cattlemen's concerns, but this isn't anti-agriculture at all. You know, the way that we have always looked at the rural management areas, and this year, the local groundwater stewardship areas, just like the AMA, we need in rural a balancing tool. So we see this legislation as a balancing tool for everyone that needs to rely on this water. So in prior years, she hasn't even been willing to hear those bills, to have a debate, to have one discussion. I know that some of the media have reached out, and she has not participated in interviews. She's really just shunned the whole issue. So I'm hoping that that's not going to be the case this session, and that everybody can come together around a table to work through these issues. It's incredibly important.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor, for thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning and for sharing your experiences with what's been going on up in the northwestern part of the state with rural water. Very interesting, to say the least. So let's move on to a person who has been involved in the southeastern part of the state with forming an active management area, active management areas down there in the Wilcox Basin and the Douglas Basin. You know, over the years, when I've talked with folks about do we need some sort of a new tool to manage groundwater in the rural areas, I wish I had a dollar for every time I heard, well, they just form an active management area. Well, from what we saw happen down there, maybe it's not that easy to just form an active management area when a lot of folks feel there is definitely a need for one. So I want to introduce Steve Kiesel. And Steve is from that area, and Steve has volunteered to share some of his knowledge and experience of what's been taking place down there. Steve, what's your community's connection to water?
Well, thank you, Ron. Well, first of all, I mean, water is everything here. We're in a very rural area, wide open spaces, you know, high desert grassland. The Wilcox Basin sits in a valley called the Sulphur Springs Valley that runs north to south with mountains on either side. Neighbors to the Douglas Basin to the south of us. And we all rely on groundwater here. It's an area that gets anywhere, depending on where you're at in the year, between 11 to 16 inches of rain a year. Particularly in the Wilcox Basin, we have no other water sources other than groundwater and the rain and snow that falls from the sky. And we certainly don't have any there's no surface water, and there's certainly no CAP water down here. So we're totally dependent on groundwater. That water is used primarily here for farming, for agricultural. About as much as 97% of all the groundwater pumped in this basin, the Wilcox Basin, closer to 90% in the Douglas Basin, is used for agriculture. Most residents, like myself, rely on that groundwater for our domestic wells. Those domestic wells tend to be more shallow than the agricultural wells, generally in the 250 to 500 foot range for the domestic wells, and the agricultural wells run anywhere from 800 to, well, there are some wells, agricultural wells here, that run almost to 2,500 feet. we're seeing some troubling trends here with the groundwater. And I'll get into that with some of the other questions, but and this has been going on for quite a while. We have a long history here at agriculture, and as Supervisor Lingenfelter mentioned, this issue has nothing to do with with agriculture in general, but that we all need to find a way to secure our water future in a way that is sustainable for the long term. Just to provide some perspective of how our connection to the groundwater has changed in this valley over the past century. When the first geological survey was done here back in the 1910 to 1920 time period, there were more than 30 artesian springs in this valley where water was just coming out of the ground. And it wasn't uncommon. I've talked to some of the folks that grew up here, are in their 80s, 90s now. It wasn't unusual to dig a well to 10 feet, dig a hole 10 feet and hit water. And it wasn't until the 1950s that really water extraction became a big deal here. But certainly we're nowhere close to where we were just not even more than 100 years ago, not much more than 100 years ago. And so in that short period of time, we've seen a significant drop in our water levels.
Well, keeping that in mind, what do you worry about most when it comes to water in your community for the future?
Well, mostly worry about the consequences that the continued unmanaged groundwater pumping will bring to this area and what it means for the state, for our future. For example, using the Wilcox Basin perspective, we're pumping groundwater, and this is based on ADWR estimates. And my guess, and this data is going back a few years, anywhere from 5 to 8 times higher. We're pulling out 5 to 8 times more water than is going back in due to natural recharge. Just like your checking account, the more you take out, the less it goes in, the lower the level is going to get. So that means more and more domestic wells are going dry. We're seeing some of the worst land subsidence rates in the state at this time, according to the United States Geological Survey. And earth fissures are routinely closing major roads in the area, and those fissures are due to overpumping of the groundwater. So I will say, as a domestic well owner, you know, we're like the canary in the coal mine. We tend to have the shallower wells, and we tend to be more sensitive. Our situation tends to be more sensitive to those drops in groundwater levels. And in my own experience, I share a well with a neighbor, and we've seen our well level drop 150 feet in less than 20 years, in just over 20 years. I'm sorry. We've seen a rate of drop of up to 6.5, up to almost 6 feet a year. There are other areas in this valley, in this particular area, that have seen wells drop as much as 10 feet a year. This is a difficult situation. Many people here live on limited incomes, and when that happens, it can be very life-changing and very stressful, because you either have to deepen your well or drill a new well, depending on your specific situation. And the cost for those kinds of things has skyrocketed in recent years as demand has gone up. I've had almost all of my immediate neighbors have also had to deepen their wells. Some, if they're fortunate, they can afford to do that. If they can't afford to do that, they end up arranging for situations to haul water. So we worry about that and what that will bring for most of our neighbors, and what as some have been forced to sell or move on or find other living arrangements where the water is a little more secure. The other thing I worry about relative to the water situation here is, and Supervisor Lingenfelter kind of alluded to this, you know, back in 1980, when the Groundwater Management Act was passed, they made the decision to exclude rural areas. here we are 42 years later, and that decision has not been revisited or not been significantly changed. It is still the wild, wild west here. It is totally unregulated still. And, it's a challenge because we've had a number of periods, even when the Groundwater Management Act, the aquifer here in the Wilcox Basin was being stressed significantly, and yet nothing was done here in the Wilcox Basin. The situation changed after that due to economic factors in the mid 70s. Water usage dropped significantly, and we saw a more sustainable level of water use. But that's really changed in the last 15 to 20 years, and yet, despite numerous attempts, or multiple attempts, I should say, to bring that to the attention of our political leadership, that's been basically ignored and nothing has happened. So I worry about that lack of leadership, that lack of foresight from our political leaders to address this issue because our future depends on it. It's almost as if they're allowing the future of this area to be foreclosed with every gallon of water that's being pulled out of the ground.
Absolutely. Steve, before I ask you the next question, I just want to remind the folks that have joined us for the webinar. If you do have questions, and I see a lot of them coming into the chat, some of them, there's an indication that they're going into the Q&A, raised hands and so forth. Please enter your questions in the chat, and we're going to try and get responses to them, as many as we can during the time period that we've been allocated this morning. So thanks. Steve, back to you. There have been a couple of issues that have gone to the voters recently for forming an active management area, one in the Douglas Basin and one in the Wilcox Basin. Are you hopeful that with the passage of the Douglas AMA, even though the Wilcox AMA did not pass, there will be some benefit from it?
Well, certainly in the Doug. Yes, thank you, Ron. Good question. I think certainly the Douglas Basin. We're very hopeful for what the AMA will bring to the Douglas Basin. As again, as Supervisor Lingenfelter mentioned, the AMA has its shortcoming. I'll talk a little bit about that in another question, but it does some very beneficial things for improving the health of the water situation in that area. Even with an INA in the Douglas Basin for over 40 years, in fact, before the Groundwater Management Act, they had a water conservation area in that area. So they've had many years of having that kind of regulation protection in their groundwater. But even with that, with some of the trends we've seen, again, Supervisor Lingenfelter alluding to, with some of the external entities coming into the state and looking at our water resources and the unlimited extraction of those resources. We've seen, even in INA in the Douglas Basin, almost a 30% increase in water use in the last 15 to 20 years in the Douglas Basin. So we know the AMA will help there, and it'll help to move. The advantage of the AMA is that it helps to move you from that situation of overdraft where you're taking out more water than is going in, and moves you towards a more sustainable level of water use. We know that that there will certainly be some spillover effect into the Wilcox Basin, but and we're excited that ADWR has already started working on establishing the management goal for the Douglas Basin, and working on some of the administrative areas. But it's a slow process, and it's going to take a while to get us there. But at least we're moving in the right direction there. So yes, we're very hopeful for that.
Why do you think the question in the Wilcox Basin was not successful and did not pass?
Well, let me just preface that by saying, I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of residents in this area, both in gathering signatures for the petition for the AMA, primarily in the Wilcox Basin, but also in the Douglas Basin, and then campaigning for the yes vote. And I will say it's important that our leaders don't misinterpret the no vote here in the Wilcox Basin to mean that residents here don't care about what's happening with our Wilcox Basin groundwater. I would say it was very overwhelming, the number of residents that realize we have a problem. They may not have known the specifics, but the more they learned about what's happening with groundwater pumping in this area, the more they were supportive of some kind of change. The problem is that we all agree that there's a need for change. It's difficult to come to agreement on what that solution is, and that's what we found out when it came to the vote. There is a significant amount of anxiety, anger, frustration, and that has exacerbated by the changes in the way we've seen the changes we've seen in agriculture in this area. We've seen one particular operation, industrial ag operation, move into the valley just 7 years ago, and in those 7 years, since that 7 years, they now own 60% of all the irrigated land in this basin. And they're consuming more water than the whole city of Tucson. So it's almost like we have a city of Tucson sitting out on one end of the valley, pumping all that water out, and people are just can't fathom how we could allow that to happen. And they're very angry and upset about that, and rightfully so. When it comes to why the AMA did not pass, the real problem there was the AMA itself in some respects. While the AMA, we told folks this is a necessary first step, but we always had to follow that up with it. We know the AMA has its shortcomings. It doesn't address some of the specific rural issues, and that's a tough sell. It's a very complicated issue, and if people are uncertain about what kind of change that's going to bring, they tend to vote no on these kinds of things. And there's a significant segment of the electorate here that is very skeptical of government intervention, anti-regulation, and so forth. And something like the AMA is a very tough sell to that audience, even though they recognize the problem. So those are some of the factors.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure that Chairwoman Tanya Lewis has an opportunity as well to express some of her concerns about water in the area where the Yavapai Apache Nation is located. So I'm going to move on to Chairwoman Lewis. Thank you, Chairwoman, for joining us this morning. Again, we certainly appreciate you taking your valuable time and spending part of your early morning with us this morning. But what is your community's connection to water?
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate being here with the panel. It's a very important subject. So thank you for the opportunity. Because water is so important to us here at the Verde Valley and with the Yavapai Apache Nation, I'm going to introduce myself in my native language, because that is what I'm taught culturally out of respect when we begin to speak of natural resources. And for the audience, she Tanya Lewis Hanse, Yavapai Doje and Nation Nantan. Nde Nshle, Doje Hati, Standing Walnut and Sling. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tanya Lewis. I am the Yavapai Apache Nation Chairwoman. I was born and raised here in the Verde Valley, specifically in Clarkdale, is where I was born and raised. I am of the Standing Walnut clan, which is here in the Verde Valley, which ties my roots and my family here to the Verde Valley, and I am the daughter of the late Lyman and Ethel Lewis of Clarkdale. So our community's connection to the river and to water specifically is we have a deep cultural bond. With us as the Yavapai Apache people, we are two distinct different tribes. We are Yavapai and we are Apache. Both of them, we have our own language and we have our own culture. So I know some of us are unaware of this, but we are two distinct peoples that live together here in the Verde Valley. To us, the river is not just an object. Water is just not an object. It is a life. It is a being, because without water, it provides life and growth to our natural resources, to the earth, and everything that provides us the things we have today here in all of our communities, wherever we are in this world. And also, and the river defines the physical character of our community, and it always will, because that's what drives us to be good stewards to the Verde River and good stewards to the lands and natural resources. And because the connection is so deep, we as Yavapai Apache people, no matter where our lives take us, whether it's in another state, another country, wherever we may be, we always have that calling to come home, which is here in the Verde Valley. And we see that to this day, because some of us, we are not born and raised here, or we are, and we take our families off to venture off into careers or build our family. But when we come to retirement age or older ages, we have that drive to come home. And that's what we do. And we see that to this very day. We have been here since time immemorial. We have been here. This is our home. In 1875, the US government rounded us all up and force marched us to San Carlos, which we eventually were allowed to come back home. And we did. Some of us made the trip and some of us did not because of our elderly age, and especially our young children. So some of us did come home, but we are here today, and this is our home, and we will be here forever. We acknowledge this when we were force marched from the Verde Valley to San Carlos Reservation, and we commemorate our return home. And this honors our ancestors who made this huge sacrifice to come home. We do this annually through our Exodus Day commemoration, which we hold the last Saturday of February. When we do that, we have cultural activities that occur, and we also open with prayer, because without our ancestors, we wouldn't be here to this day. And so we thank them, we acknowledge them, and we honor them. That's why we are here today, here at home in the Verde Valley.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Can you share with us what you're worried about when it comes to groundwater, especially with its connection with the Verde River and your community?
Yes, we know that in most of the state that the underground water is connected to the surface water, which I am confident that Nathan, Mr. Miller, is the expert in this area. He seemed very enthused to speak of that, and we appreciate that knowledge and expertise. And we've lived in our experience that we've lived along the river for many, many generations, and we're still here along the river. And we know that the water comes from the springs, and the water that flows, the underground supports our river. With that, because of that, we are working with technical experts on the integrated hydraulic model that can look at the connection between surface water and groundwater. And it's not news that there's a relationship between groundwater and the water that flows in the Verde River. So as we see, as the development and the area is continuing to grow throughout the state of Arizona, and especially in the Verde Valley, we've seen an increase in groundwater pumping in the Verde watershed. And that has resulted in significantly lower flows in the Verde that we see today. We have stream gauges that are recorded the decline in the river as the number of groundwater wells have increased along the river. So we're seeing that, and we have gauges to verify that. So we know that to be stewards of our flowing river, we must also be stewards to the groundwater.
Are you optimistic about, what are you optimistic about, I should say, when it comes to water in your community?
Mhm. So what I am optimistic about is like this panel, this specific panel that we have all been invited to join, is that this is a start of coming together. We all share the same compassion and the same goal and idea for our communities where we're at. I'm optimistic the conversation about water in the state is finally at the forefront. The conversation of policymakers are paying attention to water stewardship in rural areas because it's very important to us. And I appreciate the comments made about needing a balancing tool is very important as well. And the comments about there's 2 Arizonas. It's important that our legislators pay attention to that. And I'm also hopeful people recognize ensuring the nation's water supply must also include partnerships from non-tribal communities and the state of Arizona. And I'm also hopeful on the water management will help settle our water rights because we have been in water negotiations for 40+ years. The Yavapai Apache Nation, and to date, we do not have a water settlement. So we've been going on this for many years. And this helps secure a flowing Verde River, by extension, our reservation as our permanent tribal homeland. The water settlement would not only provide assurance to our community, it could bring certainty and tools for collaborative water management to the Verde Valley. And by working together, I'm also optimistic that we can protect the Verde River and our homeland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I think a lot of us have had a concern for a number of years about the water settlements as well as the adjudications taking place, and the need to get those resolved so we can move forward. And we know what we have to move forward with. But again, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. We only have a couple of minutes left. I have one question that has jumped out at me from the chat. And Nathan, there's a question out there about just how long it takes, water. And somebody actually indicated that the CAP water was recharging the aquifers, and in some ways it probably is. But how long does it typically take surface water to recharge the aquifers that we have around the state?
Well, the true answer is it's very complicated, and it really depends on the subsurface geology. So
we got about 1 minute, Nathan.
Yeah, what layers? Yeah, what layers there are between the land surface and the aquifer that is really going to affect how long it takes the water to move down. So CAP water, they may be referring to managed aquifer recharge projects where we're intentionally putting water into these recharge basins and allowing it to seep into the ground. I will say that some of the models assume 15 to 20 feet per year for recharge rates, but I think when all of those when the sediments get saturated, sometimes it can move a lot faster than that.
Interesting. Okay, well, it looks like we're out of time, folks. I hope you all found our online seminar a good use of your time this morning. I want to thank our panelists again for sharing their perspectives with us. Again, I want to thank our sponsor, the Environmental Defense Fund, for putting on the Morning Scoop this morning and sponsoring it. And with that, I think I'm about ready to say goodbye to all of you, and have a good day the rest of your day. I think we're going to see our screen just go blank in a minute. So I was trying to head that off a little bit by having the opportunity to wish everybody well.